Good morning.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Tracy, and we're back at Kett's Books for another Books at Lunchtime. And I am absolutely beside myself with excitement because we're going to be talking about this book today, M&I. And we've got the author. He's here. Hello, Ronan.
Hello. We've all got our membership cards.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Your book has been quietly, word of mouth, passed around, and the number of people who have just one at a time said, have you discovered this? Before I actually discovered it for myself is, more than I can count. Tell us about your book.
So it's called Leonard and Hungry Paul. It came out in March 2019, and it's about two quiet people, two gentle people, and how they, and actually all the people in the book in some ways are trying to negotiate how to engage with the world without becoming overwhelmed by it. And over the course of the novel, we see sort of small changes, but significant changes in their lives, and how they adapt and how their way of life actually, and their outlook kind of sustains them through change, and is quite enduring in terms of being a support in their lives. So it's really an examination of the kind of people who often get overlooked in life. And I suppose questioning, we all wonder about the state of the world and what's the thing we're missing. And it sort of just explores, well, maybe these people have the thing that's missing. And that's really what the book does.
Right. Well, you've been enjoying it. My sister said that she thinks that it has quite a lot of marriage advice in it. So I went back and started rereading it. What's the response been like?
For me, sorry, is that?
Well, no, what's the response been like from the public? Have you been surprised, or did you know that it was going to be popular?
No, I didn't know. Like, I wrote it not thinking I wrote it thinking it wouldn't be published, and not for any self-deprecating reason. But my background is in music, really, and I'd never really written anything before, other than songs. So I didn't really write it with the idea of becoming a writer or anything like that. So I just wrote it. Really, I had this sort of character, Leonard. I was sort of pregnant with Leonard, and I just wanted to get to know him. And I decided I'd write about him a bit every day. It was in February of about, I think, 2017. And I had a new diary, and I said, I'll use this to write about this guy, Leonard. And after about 2 or 3 days, I said, forget it, I'll just write a novel. I'll just try and write a novel. So I just kept going on that front. And then when it came out, the first publisher I sent it to actually was Blue Moose. I sent it to them on a Friday night at about midnight. And Kevin Duffy, who runs Blue Moose, has dogs. So he gets up early in the morning. And he emailed me the next morning, and he'd seen the first 3 chapters and said, will you send me the rest of it? And then about 2 weeks later, I got a lovely email while I was in a bookshop telling me what he thought about it and looking to publish it. So it happened quite quickly. And actually the way it's gone out in the world, because our marketing budget was quite tight. It was about 50p or between 50 and 60p for the book. So it was really relying on word of mouth. And what's happened, we were joking saying with coronavirus, they talk about flattening the curve. The curve for indie publications is flat anyway. It's been like one of those, I described it like a Rube Goldberg machine. Those machines like the game Mousetrap, where, like a chicken lays an egg, that rolls down a chute, and that forces a gun to shoot a balloon, and then some water pours over. So it's been like that one random event after another has just kept the book going. And it's actually turned out to be the biggest seller for Blue Moose. And it was, I think, the second biggest selling indie publication in the north of England last year. But it's done that quietly. Like, it's just been really from readers reading it and passing it on. So there was no real campaign, and I think that's kind of in the spirit of the book. Actually, I don't think like once it started doing well, some of the bigger publishers started sniffing around, and I really want to say with Blue Moose and kind of to do it this way. I much prefer the kind of contact with readers, the contact with the book world, rather than it being a big marketing strategy that's over in a month and then they move on. So this has just been, it's been a constant nice level of just the book leaking out in the world, which I think is very, very Hungry Paul,
It's
I also wonder, Ronan, particularly with this year in lockdown, like the people that I've known, and it's what's been really interesting for me is that I've read it and I've spoken to somebody else and they've gone, oh yeah, I read that. And they go, yeah, it's great, isn't it? And I wonder whether there's just something about the subject matter and this sort of meditation on taking things a bit more slowly and this sort of gentle approach to life that's resonating with people at the moment. Because I've seen on Twitter, when people have been talking about your book, I've seen similar things been said, that actually it's the absolute perfect escapism lockdown book. You see, like the book that we need in 2020. What do you think about that with your characters? I had a friend the other day saying to me, she just read it. She said, is Hungry Paul actually quite aspirational? Is there something quite aspirational about him, even though he's quite happy with what he's doing? So it's got a lot of conversations going about, the nature of being gentle or finding your place in the world and being satisfied with it. What do you think about that?
I certainly think it's appealed to people to read it during lockdown. But it's funny, it also, before lockdown, people were saying it's the book I want to read while Brexit's going on, or the book I want to read while Trump is going on. And I think what Hungry Paul in particular has is that when there's a lot of change in the world, people tend to focus a lot on the change, and it tends to preoccupy both attention at an individual level and in terms of wider societal conversations. And I think what he does is he pays attention to what doesn't change. And the line I sometimes use to explain it, it's not in the book, is that, there's a reason why sailors navigate by stars rather than waves. It's very important not to always pay attention to what's not changing. In any difficult situation, always pay attention to what's not changing. So in that sense, the new environment, the book has found its readers and resonated with readers. But I suppose the message is that the things that are in the book or the book talks about are always there. So it doesn't really matter what the surrounding environment. From a marketing point of view, you can certainly see how readers will say, just give me something that's, but I need my brain to settle for a little while. I can see the appeal of it. But I think in terms of the aspirational side, I think Hungry Paul doesn't really set aspirations outside of himself. And I think actually one of the things that makes him a bit different in the book is that I think all the characters go through some sort of change. Whereas I think in his case, I think it's the reader who goes through the change. I think he stays the same and we see him differently at the end. And I think that's part of his appeal, because I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in Ireland, a 30-something man who lives at home with his parents, it's like, that's all I need to know. There's no more. You sort of think you can fill in the rest. He'll stay there. The parents will eventually die. He'll stay in the house and will do nothing to the house. And you think you know this person. So I kind of wanted to pick a type that I felt people would have a view on. And just to see if by showing his way in the world, it would draw attention to the fact of how wrong we can be about people, and also the value of things that you wouldn't normally pay attention to. And the big virtue he has really is just being around. He's around for his parents. And there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, oh, that's really interesting. And I went through that journey with him too, because that first scene, and I just love this. And in fact, I read it again this morning for the third time. It's when he appears in his bathrobe because he's taken up martial arts. That will never stop to make me giggle, or fail to make me giggle. But you're quite right. I mean, the impression that I had initially from him, it was very different as the book is carried on, and you get those kind of more nuances, the nuances of his character, and also you're absolutely right. You sort of shed off all those misconceptions you have about his family situation. This is a really interesting comment on the human condition here. I like this.
And I think one of the lines, and it's funny, at this stage I've discussed the book enough that I think I'm starting to understand it. I've had a lot of discussion with people. There's a key conversation he obviously has with his sister late on in the book. But I think one of the most important parts of that scene is immediately afterwards, he's back just to do normal stuff. He's just back looking through drawers, looking for his socks and stuff. And that's sort of the way he is. He's not, he's just really living his life. There isn't really, it doesn't rely on conflict. It doesn't rely on drama. And that's one thing very much in particular in the book I I didn't want to have a narrative arc that is sort of predictably building up. And there are numerous sort of red herrings sort of in the book around maybe expecting a big drama around the wedding, or in terms of what happens to him later in terms of his employment situation, that don't really lead anywhere. They're kind of just there just to sort of give you sort of a sense that, you know, he does have this sort of prospect of change, but he doesn't really change. He just sort of continues gently flowering, you know.
You mentioned in an interview or something I was reading about you recently about your use of rest chapters in the book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this is very recent. Yeah, I was doing it was sort of a literary salon, which is a very highfalutin name for basically a Zoom get together of various writer types, and I was just talking about reading and reading speeds. And I mentioned that in Leonard and Hungry Paul, there are a couple of rest chapters. So, for example, there's a chapter where Helen is in the kitchen and gets the note from Hungry Paul that he's gone off to do the visiting, and she's just reflecting on where things are at and where her life is on the cusp of a change. You have one where Grace is at home and she has a sort of crap breakfast and sits there sort of picking the dry skin off her toes and throwing in the fireplace and that kind of stuff. Even the chapter, I think, where Hungry Paul is going on his postal round. And I think part of that is around trying to, it's about trying to manipulate the pace of the reading, but it's also, if you're trying to make the point about just paying attention, slowing down, you don't want to keep feeding the reader incident. You want to make sure that the reader has, you know, a chapter that might feel like a bit of a bath where they can just sort of sit and just soak up the character, soak up the feeling of the book. And it's one thing that's interesting to me, because I said I'd never written a book before, so I didn't really know what I was doing. But it's interesting to me how the sort of state of mind I felt I had writing the book seems to be preserved in the book. You know, the people who read it, the way they describe it, it's kind of like, yeah, that's how I felt when I was writing it. So it's almost like it carries that, whatever spirit you write it in, it's sort of held on the page, and the reader kind of, it's a question of resonance then. So if you have these quiet moments that you sort of just feel the book needs that people feel the quiet when they read it. It's interesting how it works.
I also really enjoyed the scene talking to Grace about just the presence, that's what matters in the end. And if, you know, it doesn't matter if things get difficult later in life and with older parents and just whatever's coming back, the fact that you were there, that you went for walks, that you played games, that's what you have in the end, the fact that you did. So it is very much about making every moment count. I've hugely enjoyed it, and I'm fascinated that you've said in another life you would speak a different language. You wouldn't speak English because, or in addition to, you've got quite a thing for foreign language, haven't you?
Oh, well, yeah, actually, I did an interview at the end of the year where I was asked the question, you know, if you were to live a different life, what would you do? And without thinking, I blurted out, speak a different language. And afterwards, I was thinking, yeah, I've been thinking about that for a while. So I started then in January, just on foot of that remark. I said, you know, you should do something about it. So I've been learning Japanese all year, just on Duolingo. My thumbs can speak a bit of Japanese. My mouth is still a bit behind, but what I'd like to do, my purpose of it, I would like at some stage to live abroad, something I haven't done. I would also like to be able to read more. I read a lot of Japanese literature, but it can be very slow to be translated. Like, for example, Yoko Ogawa was The Memory Police was on the International Booker List, translated by Stephen Schneider. That was published in Japan in 1994, and it took 25 years to get into English, even though she's an award-winning, very famous author. So I'd like, it's actually going to be quicker for me to learn Japanese than wait for them to be translated, even if it takes me 20 years. So that's my sort of long game, basically. But I'm enjoying it, actually. I've learned a lot, because I kind of feel as well, if you're a writer and you're playing around in language, I think there can be a tendency to sort of think about language in terms of English, that language is what English is. Now, I speak a bit of Irish, and, you know, I've done French at school and stuff, but learning Japanese has made me think differently, and sort of put me back to sort of the really beginning of being a baby in language terms of sentence structure. Because when you're fluent in a language, you'll knock off a sentence without thinking about it. But when you have to build that from scratch as a learner, It makes me pay attention to how sentences are constructed and the order of words, and actually how a lot of the things we think are rules are quite local things, including structure. And that's very important. Narrative structure in English language books, there's a real narrative arc, and this conflict is it's your basic default. But that doesn't exist, or certainly not to the same extent, in the literature of other countries. So thinking differently about structure, I think, is a healthy thing for someone who's a reader or a writer.
Fascinating that you do have an inclination toward reading books in translation. We have some of them that you've recommended here. If once people have read Leonard and Hungry Paul and then have read it again, because they will, what books would you recommend that other readers that readers move to?
Well, yeah, I have a selection of books that I think people might enjoy, and so the first one actually is a Japanese book, and this is by Hiromi Kawakami, and it's translated by Ted Goosen, and it's called People from My Neighbourhood, a very sort of Sesame Street sounding title. And Hiromi Kawakami is one of my favorite Japanese authors. She's done a few different types of books, and then she's done some experimental books as well. Record of a Night Too Brief as well. There we are. Stranger Than Dog is a beautiful book. But this one, she had another one last year, The 10 Loves of Mr. Nishino, and I was really delighted to read this one. It's very different. It's basically a series of, I'd say, about 20 or 30 or so very short vignettes. They're quite abstract and quite playful, about kind of the fantastical sort of characters who live all in the neighborhood. And some of it's kind of supernatural and quite strange. And I'm delighted to see her return to that, because she wrote quite an abstract collection of stories called A Record of a Night Too Brief, which was translated by Lucy North. And I think she was discouraged by the reaction to it because it was experimental. And I'm glad to see her getting more into that space. So this is one I'm going to return to. I read this in August for Women in Translation Month, which is every August. And because I was on holiday at the time, or off work anyway, I read it in a day, because it's only about 100 pages or so. And I think I read it too quickly, so I want to go back to that. But that's one that's a lovely feel to it. The characters, again, are quite vivid. It's very sort of playful, but she always has just this wonderful atmosphere in her books, and she's got this really, she makes kind of these very quick observations that you kind of miss, and you kind of say, oh, that's actually quite funny, or that's quite clever. So she doesn't, she relies on you to be awake. And the next book I was going to select was Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. I think Diane is probably the best writer of prose around. So this is some historical fiction. It's set around the Thames River, and a really interesting story around a very sort of sad incident that's happened in the river, and how that plays out in the lives of the people. But at sentence level, there's nobody to beat Diane. Like, really, I love Thomas Hardy. And sometimes I feel, you know, you have to go back to the 19th century where people really try to thread poetry throughout their prose. And I think Diane is really a sort of a modern master at that. And she's very, very good storyteller as well. I do like storytellers. I like when writers try and give us, you know, new narratives. I think she's good at that. But at prose level, sentence level, there's no one better.
There's an awful lot of folklore in that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, and it's very rich as a book. You know, there's individual chapters you could sort of take out and say that stands as a piece of work in its own right. Yeah, and I think she does research her stories quite well, and she uses that research very sensitively in her books. So you don't get this sort of sense of, well, I've gone to the trouble of reading these 10 books, and you guys are going to suffer with me through it while I tell you my notes. She's at heart a very perceptive storyteller, and just the language, the prose is just beautiful. It's a pleasure to read.
Yes, I really enjoyed it.
So the one probably in my top 3 books of the year for this year is Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami. No relation to Hiromi Kawakami. And this is a book, it's written in 2 halves really. It was originally published, there was a novella called Summer Story about a young woman living in Osaka in Japan, and her sort of life where she hasn't really got going in life, and talking to her sister and her niece, who her niece won't speak to anybody. Her sister works as a sort of hostess in a bar and wants to get breast augmentation surgery. And the second half of the book zooms forward 10 years when the main character has sort of established herself as a writer and getting to the point where she's thinking about having a child. She doesn't want to have a relationship. She's kind of celibate in her life, but she's thinking about having a child. And it gets very, very deep into the position of women in Japanese society is not very equal in international standards, either in terms of gender pay gaps or any other measurements. It's not possible as a single woman to adopt a child or to get IVF, that kind of thing. So it goes through that, but it's a very exploratory. Some of the reviews have said, well, it's a bit digressive in the second half. And I think that's actually quite important because she actually voices, it's one of those subjects that could easily be a polemic and just a real, one-sided sort of story about her view of how the world should be. But she just creates this brilliant space for people to consider the issue. And a really sensitive issue, and she goes through it as a real minefield, and she does it really, really well. But also, like, there's been a foot of this. She's from Osaka, and there's a dialect in Osaka Ben, which is sometimes described as Osaka is like kind of Manchester to Tokyo's London. So it's quite colourful, quite spicy in terms of its use of foul language and imagery and that kind of stuff. It was translated quite neutrally in this book by two male translators, but there's an earlier translation of the first novella that's available online by a different translator called Louise Hill-Cowie. This is by David Boyd and Sam Bett, and that's much spicier. So it kind of kicked off a little bit of a debate around how things are translated and how dialect is translated. I thought it was really, it's lovely because most of us won't be able to compare translations, so we just have one version. The next one is a book.
I'm going to put you down for a copy of that, Em. Em spent time living in Japan as well. So. Oh,
really? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's so true what you say about Osaka Ben. Like, I had sort of forgotten about that, but yeah, it's just, it has this very raw kind of reputation, just linguistically, as being quite a little bit of a harsher edge to it when they speak than I didn't live in Osaka. I lived down in the south, but yeah, I had colleagues who were from around that area, and they're like, oh yeah, Osaka Ben. Yeah, it's really interesting. But you raise a really interesting point about the merits of translation too. That we're so dependent on how people interpret things written in the native language, aren't we?
Yeah, and so few, like 95% of the world's population comes from countries where English is not first language.
Yeah.
And in the UK, the US, Ireland, only 3% of the books sold are in translation. Only a third of those are by women. So you have about 3.8 billion people in the world who are women from non-Anglophone countries, who are represented that with, say, some of the books that are published by Istros Books, which publish books from the Balkan region. They will often translate books into an English dialect. So you will have people using, regional accents and so on, regional UK accents to get across, because they have to really try and come up with creative ways to convey when you have Macedonians, when you have Bosnians, when you have Slovenes, when you have Croatians. You need to get across a regional difference, so that's how they do it. So there's a whole theory around that. The next book I was going to pick is by an Irish writer called Adrian Duncan, and this is called Sabbatical in Leipzig. Adrian is a civil engineer, and he's also an artist. He does a lot of modern art in, where there's sort of installations and so on. So this is about a man who he's in, well, it's partly set in Leipzig and it's also partly set in Bilbao. And he is, it's a really, I've never read a book like it. It's like nature writing, only about architecture and about engineering. So all the analogies and the imagery and all the philosophy of it is threaded through metaphors around bridge construction, different types of joints. And it sounds incredibly boring, right? But it is actually really beautifully done. And you can see why I don't work in a publisher in marketing, because if you have a man in your life who's hard to buy for, this is definitely the book to buy for. I think it's got it's got beautiful observations, and it's also got this great descriptive writing to really, to see the world through the eyes of an engineer, and to realize how, all the stuff, all the structures we see and everything around us that was an investment of somebody's and many people's imaginations. And to see this sort of creativity in the beauty of a particular type of joint, or or something like that, it's just really fantastic. So, and I think Adrian's a real once-off. He's won awards for this book. So that's Adrian.
And
Duncan.
he was an Irish writer, you said?
Yeah, he's Irish writer in his 30s.
Yeah.
He's based in Berlin, I think. And this is an older man who's the main character here. It's actually one thing that's come across interestingly when I've done a lot of book club discussions about Leonard and Hungry Paul. A lot of the book clubs have very few men in them. And the question has come up, the male members have sometimes said to me about Leonard and Hungry Paul, it's nice to see a positive male character in a book. There tends not to be that many. And I think this is an example, as another example, I think is Solar Bones by Mike McCormick, where you have a very rounded, sophisticated male character who's nevertheless, he's not a hero figure by any means, but just a very realistic and fully drawn character. They tend to be background characters. Even male writers tend to, when they write male characters, tend not to have positive characters as such. They prefer to have people with a darker side. But that's interesting. It's something I hadn't considered when I did Leonard and Hungry Paul, but it's really come through in book clubs, because some of the people have said there aren't that many men at the book clubs, and they couldn't see themselves in the books. I know Roddy Doyle has talked about that before. Then the last one I picked this is a great book, Big Girl, Small Town by Michelle Gallen. And it's about a character, Magella. And Magella works in a chip shop in a border town in Northern Ireland. And it's effectively, how many pages? It's about 300 pages of a brilliant character study of this. And she is an outsider figure. She does have some habits that sort of signal she may be on the autism spectrum. And Michelle has written about that. She's written articles in the Irish Times about that side of the character. But it's a fantastic character. I wouldn't have thought you could carry off a book of that length in just showing the life of this character who lives with her mother, and because she's in a chip shop, she's interacting with everyone across the town, and you really get a picture of, it's not quite at the era of the Troubles, but there's this lingering sense of menace in the background from the era of the Troubles, and there's just this undercurrent of a sort of town that nobody really cares about. But it's a really fantastic book, and it's got a lot of great plaudits, and this is her first book, and it to me it reads like an author who's very experienced in their career. The handling of character over that length is really very, very hard to do. She does it brilliantly. So there are ones I think you can see what they've all got in terms of, if you want to link them back to Leonard and Hungry Paul, they've either got a meditative or a character or a sort of prose style or some thread that I sort of felt that if you picked up on those sort of, as wine lovers say, those notes on Leonard and Hungry Paul, they are present, I think, and I certainly felt a sense of resonance among those.
They're really interesting choices, and as you say, what strikes me now even more than it did before is the similarity between the style of your book and a lot of the Japanese in translation that I think Tracy and I have both read, that it's that focus down on the small, sort of the minutiae of life, isn't it, that we don't give enough importance to. And it's really very thought-provoking, Ronan, because so you're right that so much of what we read is focused around some sort of drama, which is necessary, but actually there's so much beauty in the details that it's nice to reveal that. And those book choices are dangerously tempting. This is the problem with doing this. We keep finding books we didn't know about and that we desperately need to read. So thank you for bringing those to our attention, because they're such thoughtful, interesting, and for me at least, new recommendations.
Oh, well, I'm really glad. I think one of the pleasures actually of now that I've a book that's out in the world is that I get to talk about reading an awful lot more, and I'm meeting an awful lot more readers, and I pick up so many book recommendations, and I have a huge TBR pile, which I always say I try to don't think of it as a to be read list, because that sounds like a task list. I think I treat it as a wine cellar. So it's kind of you pick the right book for the right mood, the right time, and it's always good to have a range. Nobody tries to drink their whole wine cellar in one go. So that's why I like it.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much for talking to us. We've really enjoyed the book, and we are really enjoying handing it around, passing it to other readers. So thank you again. And we would really like to talk to you. Oh, you've got a new book coming in the spring, haven't you? Would you like to just mention that?
Yeah, it's a book called Panenka, which will be out in May. So that's all finished. The proofs of it are just going out. So I'm at that sort of nervous stage where there's only about 3 or 4 people have read it, including me. And now it's going out into the world. So that's the slightly terrifying stage. But I'm excited about it. It's a very different type of book to Leonard and Hungry Paul. It does, I think, still have some of the themes around human relationships, around family, but it's a much sadder book, I think, in ways. But I've always very moved writing it, and I my editor, who's not easy to impress, she was quite moved. My editor is Lynn Webb, who's a 73-year-old former professional wrestler. She's not easy to win over. So if I managed to move her, I was happy. But yeah, we're at that sort of stage. Bloomers are great. They do give me sort of creative freedom, and that's really all I'm interested in.
Yeah. I was really impressed with their website when I started having a really good look around, because they refer to just wanting to share really good stories, and the sort of throwaway reference to the rest of publishing as just publishing some stuff, I thought was brilliant. 190,000 books a year just referred to as some stuff, but actually they bring the really good stories, and they drive them around Britain because they believe in the individual really good story, and they're absolutely right. So you've got 2 really committed fans here, Blue Moose House.
Thank you very much.
And you. So yeah, we can't wait to see what you bring out next, and we really hope to be able to talk to you again.
That's great. Well, I'll get Blue Moose to send a couple of proofs over, maybe, so you can get a chance for an early read. So
lovely.
Excellent. Right. Okay. Super. Thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me. A real pleasure to talk to you and to meet you. And best of luck with the shop as well.
Thank you, Ronan. Bye.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.